Jaden, an 11-year-old black boy, walked the streets of the city with a determined look in his eyes. His clothes were ragged, torn at the seams from the wear of time and hardship. His shoes, once sturdy, were now barely held together by fraying laces. Every day was a battle, scavenging for food, searching for shelter, and avoiding the danger that lurked around every corner. The streets were both his enemy and his home. Despite the heavy weight of his reality, Jaden never let the harshness of life break his spirit. His face was often streaked with dirt, and his hair was unkempt, but his eyes glimmered with something more: hope. He was a kid who had seen far too much for someone his age. But Jaden still held on to the belief that something better was out there. That belief made him different from the other kids in his neighborhood. The world might have written him off, but he refused to let that stop him from pushing forward. Every day was a cycle of survival. Jaden was often seen sitting on street corners, eyes scanning the crowd for any opportunity. He spent most of his time rummaging through trash cans, trying to find discarded food or anything he could use to make his life just a bit easier. People passed him by, ignoring his presence, pretending he wasn't even there. Some would glance his way, but not many. To them, Jaden was just another invisible kid, a part of the backdrop, another face among many in a world that had no time for people like him. To those who did notice him, Jaden was a reminder of everything they didn't want to acknowledge. A black boy, homeless. His ragged clothes and dirt-streaked face were all they saw. Never the sharp intelligence in his eyes, never the kindness that lingered in his heart, despite all he had endured. To them, Jaden was nothing more than a statistic, an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their world. As Jaden walked, he couldn't help but notice the bustling crowds that streamed past him. People moved in every direction, all absorbed in their own lives, indifferent to his existence. The sharp click of high heels, the constant beeping of phones, the hum of conversations, all of it blended into a symphony of apathy. He was just another face in the crowd, barely worth a second glance. No one cared about the boy who walked in the shadows, and yet there was one person who stood out from the rest: Sarah Mitchell. She was walking briskly, flanked by her colleagues, her posture radiating confidence and authority. Sarah was the FBI chief, a respected and powerful woman who had earned her place at the top. Her colleagues whispered in admiration as she moved through the busy streets, surrounded by the kind of respect Jaden could only dream of. Her uniform was pristine, her heels clicking with a rhythm that matched her unwavering confidence. In her world, there was no room for doubt, no hesitation. She was in control, and no one could challenge that. But even Sarah Mitchell, with all her power, was vulnerable in this crowded, indifferent city. As she stepped away from a meeting with important figures, her stride faltered. A piece of food, stuck in her throat, caused her to cough violently. She grabbed her throat with both hands, panic flashing across her face as she gasped for air. Her colleagues didn't notice at first. The crowd, moving in their usual fashion, barely glanced her way. Sarah's face reddened, and her breathing became shallow as she fought to clear her throat, but it was no use. The choking sensation intensified, and her hands trembled as she struggled for a breath that wouldn't come. The busy street, filled with people who passed by without a second thought, seemed deaf to her distress. The sounds of the city drowned out her quiet gasps for help. Sarah's world, usually so controlled and confident, was suddenly slipping out of her hands. She needed help. But the people around her, oblivious to the danger she faced, continued walking without noticing the woman struggling for her life. It was then, as Sarah stumbled forward, clutching her throat, that Jaden's eyes caught sight of her. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold before him. The chaos of the streets, the rush of people, couldn't distract him from the woman's distress. Jaden's heart raced. Something told him this wasn't just another day. The woman needed help. And in that moment, despite his own hardships, Jaden's instincts kicked in. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. The city may have ignored him, but Jaden wasn't about to ignore someone else's pain. Jaden's eyes locked onto Sarah as she gasped for air, her face flushed with panic. His heart raced, but his body acted instinctively. He'd seen people choke before, on food, on smoke, on life. And in those moments, Jaden had learned the importance of being quick. He didn't hesitate. Without thinking about the crowd that stood frozen in confusion, he pushed through them, weaving between people who were too stunned to react. The noise of the city, the sounds of feet shuffling, and the murmur of voices faded away. In his mind, there was only one thing: Sarah's desperate struggle to breathe. Jaden reached her in seconds. He was small, but his arms were strong from years of surviving on the streets. He placed his hands firmly on Sarah's abdomen, just as he had seen in movies and street videos. His heart pounded, and his palms were sweaty, but his hands were steady. He gave the first hard thrust. Nothing happened. Sarah's face remained pale, her mouth still open in silent desperation. The crowd began to murmur again, voices rising in doubt. A few people made hesitant steps forward but stopped, unsure of what to do. Jaden took a deep breath, pushed harder, and with a final, forceful thrust, the obstruction came loose. Sarah's eyes went wide as she suddenly coughed violently, gasping for air. Her body jerked forward as the piece of food shot from her throat, and she sucked in a deep, desperate breath. For a moment, the world around them seemed to freeze. Sarah stood there, still in shock, her hands clutching her throat, but her breath was coming back. The immediate panic on her face slowly transformed into relief as she looked at Jaden, her eyes wide with disbelief. I can breathe," she gasped, her voice hoarse. She looked at him, her hands still shaking, but there was awe in her expression. "You saved me." The crowd that had been standing in stunned silence began to murmur again, but this time it was different. There was no mockery, no judgment. Instead, they were silent in awe of what Jaden had just done. For a moment, the world seemed to shift. Jaden, the boy who had been invisible just moments before, the boy no one had given a second glance, had just saved the life of one of the city's most powerful figures. The people, who had watched, waiting for someone else to act, now stood in stunned silence. Jaden's hands were still shaking, his heart racing in his chest, but he didn't feel scared anymore. He had done something that mattered, something real. His instincts had kicked in, and he had done what needed to be done. Sarah was alive. "Thank you," Sarah said again, her voice breaking with emotion. She reached out to him, her hands still trembling. Jaden stood there, not sure how to respond. His life had been filled with moments of fear and survival, but now, right here, he had made a difference. The crowd, realizing what had just happened, began to move, their stares shifting from suspicion to admiration. But Jaden didn't notice them. He was too busy staring at Sarah, watching as she slowly regained her composure. "I didn't know what to do," Sarah whispered, her voice still strained. "You saved my life." Jaden nodded, his chest swelling with a sense of pride. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about doing what was right. and he had done just that. As Sarah stood gasping for air, the mood of the crowd shifted. What had begun as an awe-filled silence quickly turned into murmurs of discomfort. Jaden stood a few feet away, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. He was still processing what had just happened, his mind racing. The weight of the situation was starting to settle in. He had saved her. He had saved the FBI chief. But as the murmurs began to swell, Jaden's moment of triumph quickly soured. The stares he had felt before, those of suspicion and fear, now turned to something worse: mockery. A white woman in the crowd, her arms crossed and lips curled in disdain, let out a loud, derisive snort. "Why's a kid like him even touching her?" she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Just looking for attention." Jaden's stomach twisted as the words landed like stones in his chest. He had done something good. He had saved a life. And yet, here he was, being belittled for it. He looked around, hoping to find someone, anyone who would step in, but the crowd only grew more hostile. A man, wearing an expensive suit and a smug expression, looked down at Jaden with a dismissive sneer. What does he even know about saving lives? Probably just wanted to get noticed. His tone was full of judgment, as though Jaden's very existence was beneath him. The man's words stung, deeper than anything Jaden had ever felt. Jaden's exhaustion grew as he stood there, trying to ignore the cruel remarks. The crowd continued, unfazed by the fact that Sarah was alive because of his quick thinking. Their judgments were louder than the relief in Sarah's voice. "You know," a woman behind Jaden added, her voice dripping with disbelief, "he's just a homeless kid. What kind of hero could he be?" The words echoed in Jaden's ears, filling him with confusion and frustration. They didn't see him for who he was. To them, he was just a black child from the streets, no different from any other. They couldn't see past their assumptions. They couldn't see the compassion in his eyes, the desperation he had felt to save her, the selflessness that had driven him to act. Jaden stood silently, every word from the crowd cutting deeper. He had done what they couldn't, what they didn't even think to do. But none of that mattered. They weren't interested in the truth. They weren't interested in the fact that he had acted in a moment of crisis. They only saw his skin, his poverty, and his background. And because of that, he was nothing more than an inconvenience in their minds. He looked at Sarah, standing a few feet away, still recovering. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, her breathing slowly returning to normal, but she didn't speak up. Instead, the space around them filled with the jeers of people who couldn't see the situation for what it truly was. "Probably thinks he's a hero now," someone muttered behind Jaden, just loud enough for him to hear. "What, does he think we're all going to thank him for that?" Jaden's fists clenched at his sides, but he remained silent. He knew that arguing with them would be pointless. They had already made up their minds about him, and nothing he could say would change that. For a brief moment, Jaden felt the weight of their cruelty, but then, just as quickly, he remembered why he had acted. He had saved Sarah. He had done something right, and no matter how they saw him, nothing would take that away. Sarah stood tall, her body still trembling from the shock of almost losing her life, but her eyes were now filled with fire. The last remnants of panic had faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity. As the crowd continued to whisper, their mocking glances still directed at Jaden, she could feel the weight of their judgment like a heavy cloak. She wiped her mouth, still feeling the lingering tightness in her throat, and, as she took a steadying breath, she turned to face the crowd. Her gaze cut through them like a blade, her jaw set with unwavering determination. The whispers faltered, and the group fell into an uncomfortable silence. She stepped forward, her voice firm and filled with authority. "This child just saved my life," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a clap of thunder. "What you're doing right now is disgusting." The crowd froze. The insults and mockery that had been aimed at Jaden, that had been thrown carelessly into the space around them, suddenly felt insignificant in the presence of Sarah's powerful words. She wasn't just speaking for Jaden. She was speaking for every person who had ever been judged based on their appearance, their background, or the color of their skin. She took another step forward, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You see a black child who's homeless, and you immediately assume he's nothing. But look at him. He's the only one here who had the courage to act. You don't see his worth because of his skin, but he's worth more than all of you put together." Her words struck her like a fist to the gut. The onlookers were silenced, their eyes now wide with realization. They hadn't just mocked Jaden. They had missed the opportunity to see a hero standing right in front of them. A boy who had acted with bravery when no one else would. Sarah's gaze shifted to Jaden, her admiration for him now palpable. She turned back to the crowd, her voice unwavering as she continued, "Don't you dare judge him. He is a hero. Just because he looks different from you doesn't make him any less." Her words echoed in the silence that had now descended upon the crowd, a stark reminder of the prejudice that had clouded their minds just moments before. Jaden stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He had saved her. He had done what no one else could or would do. And now, Sarah, someone so powerful, so respected, was standing up for him. He could hardly believe it. The shame and doubt that had flooded him earlier began to fade. The onlookers, who had once been quick to judge, were now staring at Jaden with a different kind of awareness. Some avoided his gaze, embarrassed by their previous comments, while others seemed to reflect on Sarah's words. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy, as they were forced to reckon with the injustice they had just perpetuated. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the crowd. "You don't know him," she said, her voice softer but no less powerful. "But I do, and I will make sure the world knows that this child, this boy, is worth more than your ignorance." The silence hung for a moment longer, then slowly began to break. The crowd shuffled, some turning away, others lowering their phones. The harsh words, the mockery, the assumptions, all of it had been exposed for what it truly was, shameful and unfounded. Sarah, with one final glance at Jaden, walked away with her daughter, leaving the crowd to reflect on their actions. Jaden stood in the middle of the street feeling something new, a sense of dignity. For the first time in his life, he felt seen for who he truly was. Sarah walked toward Jaden, her steps slow and deliberate. The chaos of the crowd seemed to quiet as she approached him, her gaze softening. The tension in the air, thick with the weight of her words, hung heavy around them. Sarah stopped just in front of Jaden, her face filled with gratitude and admiration. She crouched down to his level, her knees pressing gently into the concrete. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. The murmurs of the crowd, the harsh stares, the dismissive glances. All of it faded as Sarah placed a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, and for the first time her tone was gentle, not commanding. "You're a true hero." Jaden's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected this, never imagined that someone like Sarah, someone so powerful and respected, would speak those words to him. For a moment, he felt the weight of her praise settle in, but it wasn't just her words that struck him. It was the way she saw him, the way she truly saw him, not as just a homeless black boy, but as someone with value, someone worthy of respect. Sarah reached down and carefully removed her FBI badge, the symbol of her authority and power. She held it in her hand for a moment, her fingers wrapping around it as she looked at Jaden. Then, with a deep breath, she held it out to him. "You deserve recognition," she said, her voice filled with both emotion and determination. "You deserve everything I can give you." Jaden stared at the badge, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to take it. The weight of it, both physically and symbolically, seemed to anchor him in place. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was the acknowledgement of his worth. It was proof that his actions, his heart, and his bravery had made an impact in a way that words could never fully describe. The crowd, still standing at a distance, had begun to shift. Phones that had once been held high, capturing every moment of Jaden's supposed crime, slowly dropped to the sides of their owners. The sounds of murmuring started to grow, though this time the tone was different. It was quieter, almost sheepish. Some of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their faces flushed with embarrassment. They began to understand, in that moment, just how wrong they had been. Their judgments, their prejudices, their assumptions, they had all been exposed for what they truly were. The crowd began to realize that Jaden hadn't acted out of a desire for attention. He had acted out of compassion. He had saved a life, and the color of his skin had nothing to do with it. One by one, the apologies began. "I'm sorry," a woman said, her voice barely audible. "I should have never assumed." She trailed off, and another voice followed. "I was wrong. Thank you, Jaden." Even those who had spoken the harshest words now seemed to realize the depth of their mistake. The once hostile crowd, which had stood against Jaden, now stood in collective silence, realizing the enormity of their bias. The damage had been done, yes, but in this moment, Jaden had done something that they could never undo. Their misconceptions had been shattered. As Sarah stood and watched, she felt a small sense of peace. She had done what she could for Jaden, but it was clear that his bravery, his selflessness, had done the heavy lifting. It had not just saved her life. It had exposed a truth far deeper than any of them could have imagined. True worth cannot be measured by appearances. Jaden, holding the badge in his hand, stood a little taller, his chest swelling with pride. The world had seen him for the hero he was. The next day, the story of Jaden's heroic act spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, headlines across the city were dominated by the tale of the homeless boy who had saved the FBI chief's life. The story wasn't just about a dramatic rescue. It was about something much deeper. It sparked conversations about racism, prejudice, and the judgments people made without knowing the truth. Jaden, who had once been invisible to the world, was now at the center of a citywide awakening. No longer seen as just another street kid, Jaden was recognized for his bravery, his selflessness, and his courage in the face of the crowd's harsh judgment. The world was finally seeing him for who he truly was. A hero. People who had once looked past him, ignored him, or assumed the worst about him, now saw a young man with a future full of potential. And that potential was finally being recognized. Not just by the city, but by someone who had the power to change his life. Sarah, now a firm ally, stepped in to offer Jaden the future he deserved. She promised to help him access education, resources, and opportunities. With her support, Jaden began to leave behind the streets he had known so well. For the first time, he could imagine a different life. A life where he wasn't defined by his circumstances, but by the choices he made and the person he was becoming. Sarah's promise wasn't just about helping Jaden. It was about giving him a chance to grow and thrive. She wanted him to be more than just a survivor of hardship. She wanted him to become someone who could stand tall, knowing his worth, and contribute to the world in ways that no one, including Jaden, had ever dreamed possible. The city, once oblivious to Jaden's existence, was now forced to reflect on their preconceived notions and biases. What had happened on that street had changed something deep within them. It was no longer just about race, class, or background. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of where they came from or how they looked. It was a lesson in humility, empathy, and the power of kindness. In the final moments of the story, we see Jaden walking alongside Sarah. The cityscape behind them reflects the change that has taken place, both in the physical world and in the world of their hearts. No longer a homeless boy, Jaden was now a young man full of promise and potential. He had been given a second chance, a chance that many others never get. But what was even more powerful was the transformation in the hearts of those who had once looked at him as nothing more than a statistic. They had seen him save a life, and in doing so, he had saved them from their own biases and ignorance. As Jaden walked, his stride was confident, and his future, once uncertain, was now filled with possibilities. The story of his courage had touched lives, and in turn, it had changed the hearts of those around him.